You're listening to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor, powered by bbbgive.org. Here we explore the motivations that form the basis of giving and service. We inspire generosity and celebrate the transformative effects that giving and service have on the human spirit and on community. The conversations featured on the podcast also uncover giving strategies that educate and provide tools to help listeners make impactful gifts of both their time and money. We hope you enjoy this episode.
I give you my heart. I find myself on my feet with 15 leaves. Everything carries its own light on the walls. I woke up to slaughter, my heart opening to cemeteries of moon, the parasites, the drizzle, the mud crowning the undergrowth with immense sadness. I knew death when I dressed in my uniform. I found the index of my solitude, my country and its legal jargon, its piety, its fiction. Yes, it loves me, really. I give my blood as the blood of all fish.
This is the Heart of Giving podcast, powered by bbbgive.org. Give.org is the nation's standards-based charity evaluator, and it's your one-stop source for information on giving and reports on the most asked about charities. I'm Art Taylor. Today I have the honor of speaking with Ricardo Alberto Maldonado, a remarkable poet, translator, and literary advocate whose work bridges cultures and inspires change. Ricardo is the president and executive director of the Academy of American Poets, and his journey from Puerto Rico to the forefront of American poetry is as inspiring as it is impactful. His debut collection, The Life Assignment, has garnered critical acclaim, and his efforts in bilingual anthologies have not only showcased diverse voices, but also raised funds for crucial causes like Hurricane Maria recovery. In today's episode, we'll dive into Ricardo's multifaceted career, exploring how poetry can be a vehicle for social change, cultural preservation, and the community's healing. We'll discuss his vision for the future of American poetry, the importance of representation in literature, and how the act of giving, whether through words, translation, or advocacy, can shape the world. So, Ricardo, tell me what it's like to be part of a community of people who use the literary word to make change.
So that's the question I ask myself every morning and every evening before I get into the office, and then when I go back home and meet my cat, take the train and read a book of poetry on my way home. But before I answer, I wanted to thank you for hosting me, and thank you for the Heart of Giving podcast. I hope that whatever I share with you all is of use in some way, and perhaps an invitation to see yourselves as part of a network or a constellation of folks who believe in the power of art to make the world more legible to each other and to ourselves. So what it means to be a part of this community. The first question I have in response to your question is to think of the word community and what it describes. I am privileged to be part of a community whose activities take place online and in person. And by online, I mean it's a national organization, the Academy of American Poets. We've been around since 1934, and since day one, the mission has been very simple, which is to serve poets and readers, to celebrate poets and poetry. And by celebrating poets and poetry, you're celebrating readers. And by celebrating readers, you're celebrating budding poets, enthusiasts, teachers, high school students. It's been really shocking to me to realize under the auspices of this organization how frequently we intersect with poetry in our lives, whether that means on the train or, more interestingly, you see a bit of language somewhere, let's say graffiti, or perhaps you hear something, misunderstand something. There's poetry in that, because generally language is so charged with meaning and potential and possibility. And so being part of this organization means respecting and honoring the creation of that language and how the words in themselves point to something larger. Um, and in that sense, I celebrate the person who puts those words out there, but also the person who receives them. Um, when I was very young, um, I remember having a penchant for the word. I wanted to be a doctor, so I was doing all these classes in high school that were uh, well, they were like biology AP, for example, which I did not love that much. Although I did like the naming, right? Like you spent a lot of time naming things. Organic chemistry, for example, which I took in college, was so fascinating to me and very difficult. Um, but I just remember loving to read, and loving to read specifically poetry because it was giving me access to something I didn't understand. Poetry at times creates words for things we don't understand, and they have they trigger a response from us. A poem you read once and it stays with you in many cases forever, and you're constantly rethinking that language. And so here at the Academy, what I've liked to center as part of this colossal we that is the Academy of American Poets, comprised of all sorts of community members and stakeholders, is that we are an ever expanding we. And that means we're finding new readers all over the US and the world. We're collaborating with teachers, we're collaborating with young poets, established poets, um, and also with poets laureates all over the United States who are doing really important work bringing poetry to their communities. So this is a very long answer, Art. I gave you the whole thing just to say that um, being here as someone who has been a poet for more than 20 years, and an administrator for around that same time, or that same amount of time, it's just like running an organization requires art. Being part of an organization that values art requires sensibility to art. And I am here to usher that sensibility, seed that sensibility across the United States and the world, if that makes any sense.
It makes a lot of sense. But I wanted to ask you specifically about this on the train or on the bus and
Mm-hmm.
receiving the word as well.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that and how that resonates in your work in some way.
So there are many organizations promoting poetry in New York City. And one of them, a sibling organization, has papered uh, the subway with poems. So it's really shocking to be on the train um, and see a bit of poetry. And in fact, I remember one of the first poems I came across, and it was by Laureen Niedecker. Um, and there's a line in it, you are my country and I find it hard going. I believe that's the line. And I, of course, I understand what the word suggests, but I don't really understand fully the totality of that, of the meaning. Um, and for me, that encounter was sacred. And what I found having conversations with readers all over the nation is that exchange, that sort of like um, origin story with poetry. It's like finding that moment when all of a sudden poetry showed you something that you've known forever, but you've never been able to put into words. Um, and so that's why I'm so committed to making sure that there are poems going out there every day of the week, every day of the week. So that's the work. The work is to understand that many of us are in transit, and the poem will pull your attention. It's like a tether. It just grabs you and pulls you down, pulls you in. And in many cases, it gives you the opportunity to reflect, but it's active reflection. But it's active reflection.
Active reflection.
Mm-hmm.
So, you're of Puerto Rican heritage,
Born and raised. Born and
born and
raised.
raised,
Uh huh.
and yeah, and I think we're in many ways closer than we think we are to some of our adjacent lands
Mhm,
as, American citizens. There are certain rights that Puerto Ricans don't have
mhm,
yet. But I want to know in particular, how has, this sort of dual connection between the mainland here in the United States
mhm,
and your Puerto Rican heritage sort of
mhm.
influenced your approach to poetry and literary activism?
First, I will say that I feel like we are going through yet another golden age of Puerto Rican literature. Um, and that can be attributed to many things. Of course, there has been substantial activities by funders, um, with the understanding that the Puerto Rican poet and artist has lacked access to resources for a very long time. Um, and that's due to many things. For me, I point specifically to the Jones Act, which prevents or makes it a little bit more difficult for poets and writers to share their work with Latin American countries or receive work from Latin American countries or world, right? Because of certain laws, um, shipping laws, etc. Um, so that's a way of tackling that question. But
Say more about that. I don't think most of our listeners will understand what you just said.
so according to the law, everything that comes into the island must stop somewhere in the United States and then make it to the island. So as a result, tariffs, it's costly. It's costly. To
Hmm.
be an artist in Puerto Rico is, based on conversations I have on a daily basis, is to face lack of resources, and you find it difficult to share your work with other writers from around the world. But thankfully, there has been support, and there's still growing support. And my dream is that we understand not only the precarity, but the real beauty and magnitude of Puerto Rican arts and letters. It's very distinctive. And we have our own version of Spanish, as every community that has inherited a language, in this case Spanish and English, um, we survive by creation. And there's something really beautiful, energetic, and inspiring about Puerto Rican Spanish. The way that it absorbs English, refracts it, changes it. Um, it's very moving to me, for example, to read the work of Roque Raquel Salas Rivera, a trans poet from the archipelago of Puerto Rico, who has been gathering language from the surface of the culture and from deep within, and carving an epic about what it means to live in uh, pre and post Maria Puerto Rico. Um, Another way to tackle this question is also to say, in Puerto Rico, we live in transit, uh, between two languages that overlap, and languages that sort of clash. And as a result of that, that entropy is generative. Um, and as a practitioner, but also as a human being who believes deeply in poetry, it's been really wonderful in terms of my activism to shine a light and empower, find resources and platforms for the beautiful work, meaningful work of poets in Puerto Rico, by which I mean also poets from Latin America, by which I also mean poets from America, to understand that the poet is always in touch uh, with as many other poets and work that they can be. It's like we're very ravenous as people. If this person doesn't explain the world to me, then I'm going to move on to another person, and then move on to another person. And that's the work of literary activism, right? Setting up infrastructures to facilitate that engagement and that transit, borderless transit with sensitivity, and courage.
Puerto Rico and Mi Corazon
Hmm.
and the work there after Hurricane Maria. Talk about that some.
So when I think of that period in my life, and it's important for me on many levels. One of which is, I feel like as human beings, we're constantly trying to find our form, by which I mean trying to understand exactly how is it that we want to communicate our lives, make it legible to others. And for me, it was Maria, because my family is there and I couldn't get into contact to them for a very long time and contact with them for a very long time. And it was a catastrophe. Um, my family was spared of a lot. Other people were not very lucky. And what was affected by this tragedy were these networks. They were created immediately after. You would go into Facebook and you would type the name of a town, and then you would ask folks on Facebook to see if they were fine, if they were alive. And that's sort of the kind of connections that people were forging, right? We were creating a constellation, back to that word. Um, and that's something that happened in the diaspora as well. We may have been, the diaspora, what's the working definition or living definition of the diaspora, if not like we love from afar, but we love, right? And so we were creating yet another Puerto Rico from here. And immediately after, I believe it was a day after or 2 days after, I received a message from the editor and poet themselves, Erica Mena, who was an founding editor of Anomalous Press, and they wrote to me saying, I want to work with poets from the diaspora and from the archipelago on something material, something that we could touch, right? And so Erica put us in touch with Roque Raquel Salas Rivera and Karina del Valle Shortsky, a terrific translator, poet, and writer for the New York Times, among other things. And we started having conversations with poets in all geographies about a series of broadsides. There's a tradition of printing broadsides in Puerto Rico and many poetry communities around the world, where you produce an art object that includes a poem. So we started there, and then we realized that we had amassed a substantial number of broadsides, and there was clear appetite for an anthology. And so we collaborated with poets from the archipelago and the diaspora, and we all worked together, asking poets in Puerto Rico to translate poems that were written in English, to translate them into Spanish, and vice versa. So we all worked together in this massive project, and created a book and sent it out to print, and then used the proceeds to fund recovery efforts on the island. And we raised a good bit. Every little bit counts, and
Yeah.
this good bit came with love and intention from poets who understood that we needed to hold something that explained us, or started to ask questions about what that us means and what it could mean, right?
Well, I think that's wonderful because you used what you had to
Mm-hmm.
create something to help other people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in the end, it's not only the money you raise, but how you also made a statement to people who were hurting,
Yeah.
that they weren't alone, that there were people who really cared.
Yeah.
And what you wrote, I suspect, is as important to people today as anything else, because for those who survived, they have an account. And for those who didn't, there is a documentation of it in some ways, right?
Right.
In
It's
an
always
artful form. So I just think it's more valuable than many people may think.
this is like making scoring the sand at a beach, making some kind of mark, and knowing that the waves will come. But for this one, the wave came, but there's still remnants of traces of our writing on the sand.
Yeah. So you have taken on this role to
Mm-hmm.
lead this organization, but you're also an artist.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious to know how you balance your art with the running of an organization.
Well,
I'm sure there has to be challenges associated with that.
if you have an answer to this question, please share it with me. Um, I don't know how to answer that question because my poetry happens sporadically, but what doesn't happen sporadically is thinking creatively about the work that I'm doing.
Yeah.
Um, and they feed each other, right? One of the things I love about my job is that there's a lot I don't know. And I don't mean I don't know about the organization. Of course, I know the organization. I've been here for a year and change, but we publish a poem every day through the series, Poem a Day, and it's edited by 12 magnificent editors. And they invite 20 or 21, 19 to 21 poets to contribute a new poem every day, depending on the month. And those poems teach me something about the world. I feel like I know the world, and then I remember, oh, no, I don't. And there's Poem a Day to remind me of that. And I may not be writing all the time, but something that my former teacher and former poet laureate Tracy K. Smith taught me was I may not be writing, but I'm always listening. So it may be my writing may be spare, but when it comes with a force. This past weekend, I was up by 5:30 or 6, and I sat down and I said, well, I have my coffee and my cat is meowing, and I have this gift of a morning without having to commute, um, and a poem came in like 30 seconds. It just blah. And I may not keep it as it is, right? There's the act of revision too, which is as important as the actual writing itself. But a poem is a strike against unknowing, and at times strike against knowing as well, right? You rediscover things, and members of my community here, our community at the Academy of American Poets, remind me of that, because that's the work they're doing. And so I find myself at home wanting to emulate that example, the example that, on any given day, I find myself corresponding with our members, and some of whom are like budding poets, others who are more established, and it's a chorus. It feels like we're all saying the same thing, which is I need someone to understand this, and I carry that with me beyond the office. But I don't write all the time, but I'm always listening and I'm always reading, and that could mean a book of poetry, but it could also mean like the newspaper, or it could also be listening to a podcast or watching a Hollywood movie or an indie movie. Like, always be reading, always be in contact with art. And there are times when you may not dig what you're watching, but you're learning. You're like, oh, I don't like this movie, but structurally it's very important, right? That's what poetry taught me, right? To think about structure, to think about the ways in which things are organized, and how that affects meaning.
Yeah.
But if you can find me, like, if you have a magic wand and can stop time and give me 3 days to write poems, I'll finish my book.
Okay. So, and like in so many professions, mentorship matters.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure it also has an important connection to what you're doing in poetry
Mm-hmm.
and those who are entering this field. And you started something, you were involved in something called Canto Mundo
Mm-hmm.
and the queer art mentorship.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that some and let us understand the impact that mentorship has.
So I feel like it's very important, as generally an administrator, to create opportunities for direct or indirect mentorship. Um, we can mentor each other in many ways, one of which is modeling, conversations, and structures for other folks who are eager to learn. And then there's like the direct ways of like putting a younger writer with an older writer. And I feel like one of the the reasons I wake up with joy is precisely because I get to investigate what example of mentorship I'm coming into contact every day. So a good example is the kind of mentorship I can provide to my colleagues as someone who's been in the field for 18, 20 years. But then there's the kind of mentorship that they can offer me as people who come from different experiences and different backgrounds. There's the kind of mentorship that we quietly or not so quietly provide to other organizations, by which I mean there's nothing more beautiful than me getting a call from the administrator at another organization, say, who is part of the Poetry Coalition. The Poetry Coalition is this group we have of 25 plus poetry organizations across the nation, and the reason that it was set up by my predecessor in collaboration with all these organizations, and it was a skill share, right? Among other things, you share resources, you share knowledge, and I find myself like the beauty of that project is because it's already seeding transformational conversations, and sometimes I get a call from one of those members sharing a problem, an issue, something that we are all trying to solve for. And sometimes it's the other way around. I need help trying to figure out how to say this. And so, and on a more sort of like holistic or philosophical way, what we're doing at the Academy is seeding mentorship across all sort of like areas. When there's an emerging poet who publishes a poem, they are mentoring future readers. When there's an older poet, they're mentoring indirectly younger poets, right? It's like these lines of communication where we constantly ask ourselves, are we doing the right work? It's a kind of mentorship, but I'm speaking broadly because it's a broad category, right? But there are certain ways in which, I provide mentorship, and I am provided mentorship. My predecessor, for example, the great Jennifer Benka, has been a mentor for many years. And I still call her or text her once in a while asking for, hey, Jen, what's the best way to do this? And in she comes, and she calls me, or she sends me a text, or she sends me the link to something. Let our future be full of mentorship, direct and indirect, right? Because that means there's constant exchange of ideas. And reminds me of this line by Zukofsky, the poet Louis Zukofsky, who says, talk is a form of love, let us talk. And isn't that what mentorship is?
Absolutely.
So I just think of that often.
Well, I wanted to ask you about, you are the prelude. Let me get it right. You are the prelude.
Uh-huh.
And the New York Philharmonic partnership, that must have been fun.
It was
What
wild.
was the inspiration behind that? Tell me about it.
So I know this great Puerto Rican composer, Angelica Negro, and I have been following her work for many years. I even got to see, as a fan, an opera performed at El Museo del Barrio in uptown and Spanish Harlem. And I was so mesmerized by it. Anywho, it turns out that we have mutual friends, and years later, we just hung out one day. And it was really Hurricane Maria and then its aftermath and the protests in Puerto Rico that made us closer. We were in constant touch. We were talking about what it means to be Puerto Rican at this juncture in history. And she texted me one day, and she said, I've been asked to write a piece for the reopening of Geffen Hall. I'm looking for poems about coming together for the first time after being apart for a longer time. And I said, I want to do this. I'm going to send you a poem, and you will read it and edit it with me. And I felt like what was important for me when I was working on this poem was, first of all, the understanding that this poem would exist as music, and not only that, sung by a chorus of, is it 120 people? I can't remember, but so we
Wow.
worked together on it, and it was like we were both writing this poem together. But obviously, she gave me freedom to do what I wanted. I wrote it in Spanish, then translated it into English. I sent it to her, and she said like, I think I think this is what you want to say. And I remember thinking, oh, Angelica, you're so right. Um, and what the piece wanted to say is that like I wanted to honor that moment before we meet again.
Mm.
It's usually charged with hope, anxiety, but what we're really doing is finding a space for all of us to be together, sharing air, because that was one of like we were sharing breathing air together. Um, and um, and so she sent me a draft of the music, and I said, Angelica, I don't know how to read music, but this sounds amazing. And then she left it as a surprise. I went to see the performance, and I was in there thanks to Henry Timms,
Mm.
um, and uh, who whom I used to work with
Hmm.
before I came to the Academy of American Poets. And it was shocking to hear my words being interpreted by music and by voices. You know, a poem exists on the page, but also on the mind of the reader. Add to that, it exists. It now has a different texture of music and the voice. I was confused, baffled, excited, honored. It felt like my poem had found a different home. And I just, I just once in a while, when I feel like a little lost in my writing, I go to PBS and I typed in the name because it was rebroadcast on PBS for a little while, and there's an excerpt of it online on YouTube, and I go back to it, and I remember being in that room, and I remember the smell of the room, and then the dinner after, and then I got a little mug as a thank you. It was just like really wonderful.
Awesome.
Poems live, and then then they find these other lives that are baffling and really exciting.
Yeah. Well, Henry is a good friend, and
Huh?
Henry Timms, and I noticed that you did work together at the 92Y, which is
Exactly.
fantastic, and now he's moved on to his next
Now
endeavor.
he's moved on. Tell him I say hi. Big fan.
We'll certainly do that. Well, listen, I just want to, we got to end this interview, but I
Oh,
want to ask you one last question.
of course.
As our country and our world really grows increasingly diverse,
Hmm.
what do you see as the role of poetry in particular in embracing this emerging culture that we're creating here, particularly in the United States?
Hmm. So I'm going to go back to that line by Sukovsky. Uh, Talk is a form of love. Let us talk. That's what poetry does. And it often or at times leads to very difficult conversations, but they are necessary because they remind us of the complex chemistry of our world, right? Um, I have seen, just 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I was in Washington, D.C. with a cohort of poets laureate from all over the U.S. And it's, again, part of a program we run thanks to the Mellon Foundation. And we were there for the National Book Festival. And we had 20 poets laureate. And what was very interesting to me is that it really, representation wise, it was as wide as one could ever dream of, um, and it was very moving to understand that we were part of a chorus, and that we were working towards something. And I remember we walked into the Library of Congress, beautiful space, first time in there, and knowing that, philosophically, I was thinking, oh my God, this is a library, it's an archive. Someone will remember us in the future.
Yeah.
And I think being a part of organizations like this is just a reminder that that's where the work is, right? And so, like, saying someone will remember us in the future, that also means like, who is this us, and how can we make this us bigger? Because let's be frank, it's not like there is a table. It's so right. Everyone wants a seat at the table. Well, I'm going to say there's no table. It's this giant orb that we're responsible for. Having a wider sense of like our humanity is so important. That's also the project of poetry, saying you are one of many. And the poem will create, I'm using my hands because I'm Puerto Rican, and so the hands are doing work here, but there's like an undercurrent of humanity that I always encounter when I find a poem. I always encounter when I speak to one of our poets laureate. I always encounter when I talk to a member in, say, Chicago, where I was just there. Member who was in Chicago, but she's from Los Angeles, and it was just like, oh, I know you, even though I didn't know them, but I felt like they were kindred, and that's poetry.
Yeah, well, wonderful. Now, for those of you who are listening for the first time, this is the Heart of Giving podcast. We're a weekly show, and we do it so that you can be inspired weekly by the stories and lives and work of people in our communities who are uplifting others on a daily basis. I hope you will subscribe to the show by going to any major podcast platform. And if you want to continue to see the live video version of the podcast, you can do that by going to the BBB Wise Giving Alliance's YouTube page and subscribe there. I hope we'll see you back here next week. Thanks for listening.
You've just listened to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. To listen to our other interviews, visit heartgiving.podbean.com. That's heartgiving.podbean.com. Subscribe to our show on major podcast platforms. The thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are the views and opinions of the guests, not those of the BBB Wise Giving Alliance or program affiliates. This podcast is for information and educational purposes only and is copyrighted with all rights reserved. This podcast is protected by Podbean's terms of service.